Contract memory prices more than doubled in the first half of 2026. Not over a year, not over a product cycle. In roughly 2 quarters, the 3 companies that together supply the overwhelming majority of global dynamic random access memory issued allocation notices, and the buyers who had spent the previous 2 years loudly committing to supply chain diversification away from China found themselves staring at a nearly empty shelf. The assembler holding that shelf notice was not a second-tier player. It was the kind of buyer whose approved vendor list determines what ships inside hundreds of millions of devices. The question sitting at the center of this video is not whether Chinese memory is technically competitive. It is whether the rationing window is long enough for buyers to cross a qualification threshold they cannot uncross, and whether the incumbents can refill the shelf before that threshold is crossed. 2 clocks are running, they move at different speeds and in opposite directions. Which one governs the finish line is the only question that matters. A breakthrough in this race is not a scorecard flip. It is a change in which clock is setting the pace. The shortage clock accelerates and then eases. The qualification clock only moves forward. The side that understands which clock governs the finish line wins, and the side that mistakes price recovery for structural recovery loses ground. It cannot see it has lost. Start with the module. A single double data rate. 5 memory module, the kind that sits inside a consumer electronics device at the premium end of the market. The kind that an assembler in the Apple class tier qualifies with the same rigor it applies to its display stack or its main logic board. That module appears in procurement records at the start of 2026, flagged as allocated, restricted, not available at contracted volume. The procurement team is holding it. The shortage clock is already running. Leg 1 is the shortage sprint, and the pace of it is the detail that most coverage missed. Samsung, Micron, and SK Hynix did not catch buyers by surprise with poor planning. They executed exactly what disciplined semiconductor producers are supposed to do in a down cycle. They cut capacity additions in 2023 and 2024, reduced wafer starts, and managed inventory drawdowns. That restraint is what drove prices up when demand surged. The demand surge itself came from 2 directions at once. Artificial intelligence server infrastructure consumed an enormous share of high-bandwidth memory, which is fabricated on the same process equipment as standard dynamic random access memory. When that capacity tilts toward high-bandwidth memory production, standard dynamic random access memory supply tightens as a side effect. At the same time, broader consumer device demand recovered faster than the supply-side models anticipated. The result was not a crisis caused by incompetence. It was a shortage caused by success, and the incumbents did not have a fast answer for it. Lead times on dynamic random access memory fabrication equipment run into years, not quarters. You cannot buy your way out of a tool constraint on a 6-month horizon. ChangXin Memory Technologies, the Chinese producer known in procurement circles by its common name, had been building share in standard dynamic random access memory for several years. By early 2026, reports describe it as holding meaningful but not dominant market share, primarily in the mature segments of the market. Double data, rate 4, and early double data, rate 5. The specifications that cover a substantial portion of consumer electronics and mid-range server applications. It was not a frontier producer. It was not competitive in high-bandwidth memory. But the shortage did not open at the frontier. It opened exactly where ChangXin Memory Technologies had product available. Think of it like a highway where the 3 fastest lanes are suddenly coned off. The speed limit in those lanes is still higher, but if you need to move cargo now, you take the open lane, even if it runs 5 miles per hour slower. The question is not whether the coned lanes are theoretically superior. The question is whether, by the time the cones come down, you have already rebuilt your logistics around the route that was open. Western incumbents, pricing locked, allocation notices out, within 1 to 2 quarters of the demand surge. ChangXin Memory Technologies, qualified supplier conversations initiated inside the same window, 1 product cycle behind on leading-edge node, but present on the allocated specifications. Gap. Incumbents still lead on process node and high-bandwidth memory. ChangXin Memory Technologies is closing on addressable volume inside the shortage window. The conventional read at this point is that qualification is the moat. Western memory producers can weather a shortage because Tier 1 buyers will wait rather than take the reputational and supply chain risk of switching. I want to challenge that read directly because I think it is right about the structure and wrong about the timing. The moat is time-bounded, and the incumbents priced allocation too aggressively in early 2026, compressing the window faster than their own models assumed. The moat does not drain all at once. It drains one qualification conversation at a time. That module is in the lab now. Leg 2 is the qualification lap. Memory qualification at a Tier 1 consumer electronics assembler is not a checkbox process. It is a months-long sequence of electrical characterization, thermal cycling across operating ranges, compatibility validation across the silicon stack, firmware interaction testing against multiple operating system configurations, and reliability projection extrapolated from accelerated stress data. Industry convention puts the minimum timeline at roughly 6 months for a supplier with prior approval history at that buyer. For a new entrant with no existing approved vendor list entry, reports suggest 12 months is a more common baseline, and some categories run longer. The conservatism is not bureaucratic friction. It is risk arithmetic. A memory failure in a shipped consumer device creates warranty exposure, replacement cost, and brand damage that dwarfs the cost of a longer qualification run by several orders of magnitude. ChangXin Memory Technologies had not arrived at Tier 1 qualification conversations without preparation. For several years before 2026, it had been moving through qualification pipelines at second and third tier buyers, large original design manufacturers, enterprise system builders, the kind of organizations whose qualification rigor is high, but whose approved vendor list decisions do not make the trade press. That work produced the process documentation, interface consistency, and reliability reporting that a Tier 1 qualification requires. Reports from procurement-side analysts describe at least some Tier 1 adjacent buyers as having moved ChangXin Memory Technologies modules into active qualification by early 2026. The shortage gave the Tier 1 assemblers themselves the policy cover to bring those conversations up the chain. Here is where I want to test a hypothesis I find more useful than the simple qualification as moat framing. The qualification clock is actually 2 clocks running in parallel. There is a technical clock. Does the part meet specification, survive thermal stress, pass firmware interaction, project adequate reliability? And there is a reputational clock. Can the procurement team tell the chief financial officer and the board that they had no choice? The shortage is what started the reputational clock. Before the allocation notices, using ChangXin Memory Technologies required a procurement team to explain a policy decision. After the allocation notices, using ChangXin Memory Technologies required a procurement team to explain why they were not solving a supply problem, the frame inverted. And the reputational clock, once started, does not stop when the shortage ends. Western incumbents, requalification after a supply disruption takes weeks, because existing approved vendor list entries survive and no restart is required. ChangXin Memory Technologies. New entrant qualification, 6 to 12 months minimum by industry convention, running now under the pressure of the shortage clock. Gap. Incumbents hold the structural advantage of pre-qualification, but that advantage only protects them if they can fill allocation before the ChangXin Memory Technologies qualification clock completes. The gap just got tighter. Leg 3 is where it inverts. The incumbent assumption, and the assumption that most supply chain commentary has reflected, is that shortage-driven qualifications are temporary. Emergency suppliers get listed as strategic reserves and delisted when primary supply returns. That assumption rests on the approved vendor list being actively managed downward as well as upward. In practice, removal from an approved vendor list requires its own engineering review, its own documentation cycle, its own sign-offs across quality, engineering, and procurement. It is not automatic. It does not happen because the shortage ends. At most organizations, the operational default is inertia. A qualified supplier stays qualified until something goes wrong with the part, not until something goes right with the primary supply chain. A qualification entry in an approved vendor list is like a key cut for a lock. The locksmith who cut the key does not get the key back when the other locksmith becomes available again. You have two keys now, and when price or availability shifts, you use whichever key opens the door faster. The original locksmith's return does not eliminate the second key from existing. Think about what happens inside the organization once qualification completes. Future product generations get designed with ChangXin Memory Technologies in the component database. Cost engineering teams include ChangXin Memory Technologies pricing in their bill of materials models. Procurement teams have ChangXin Memory Technologies account relationships and contact histories. The organizational memory that began as "we had no choice" becomes "we have this option." Options that exist get exercised when price signals favor them, even after the shortage ends. Evidence from prior supply chain disruption cycles, including the 2021 automotive chip shortage that forced emergency qualifications across the industry, suggests that emergency qualifications rarely get fully reversed. The engineering resources required for a deliberate dequalification are almost never allocated when the part is performing adequately. Western incumbents, supply normalization projected through late 2026, based on reported capacity additions and demand cycle patterns. ChangXin Memory Technologies. Qualification persistence. Approved vendor list entries do not expire on supply normalization. They persist until actively removed, which requires engineering resources that are not typically allocated to removal when the part is meeting specification. Gap. This leg does not compress. It inverts. The incumbent's clock is moving towards supply recovery. The qualification clock is one-directional and does not move backward. Before the forecast, the honest leg. Because the story I have been telling is true in the market it applies to and incomplete in the market it omits. The qualification activity that reports describe is concentrated in standard double data, RAID 5, and mature node dynamic random access memory. That is the part of the market where ChangXin Memory Technologies has product. The frontier of memory demand, particularly high bandwidth memory for artificial intelligence accelerators, is a different race with a different set of competitors. ChangXin Memory Technologies has no credibly reported high bandwidth memory product in volume qualification at any Tier 1 artificial intelligence infrastructure buyer. The gap in that segment may be widening rather than narrowing because SK Hynix and Micron are deepening their high bandwidth memory process integration with advanced packaging partners, building a co-development relationship that ChangXin Memory Technologies cannot replicate on a shortage-driven timeline. If you watch only the consumer dynamic random access memory qualification story, ChangXin Memory Technologies' clock looks very fast. If you include high bandwidth memory, you are watching a segment where the lead has not compressed at all. The strongest case for the incumbent lead being real is that high bandwidth memory is where the economics of artificial intelligence infrastructure are concentrated. The strongest case that the lead is a mirage is that consumer and mid-range server dynamic random access memory is not a rounding error. It is, by volume, the larger portion of the total addressable market. A qualification lock-in at Tier 1 consumer assemblers, even without high bandwidth memory, represents a structural shift in the supplier mix for the highest volume product category in the industry. Here is where I want to push back on my own earlier framing. I called the reputational clock the one that matters for long-term lock-in. But there is a version of this story where the reputational clock at the Tier 1 level stays invisible. Tier 1 assemblers do not publicly disclose changes to their approved vendor lists. The qualification is real but opaque, which means it also cannot be used as a competitive signal, and the incumbents can claim retention of customers they may no longer fully hold. The opacity cuts both ways. It limits what ChangXin Memory Technologies can claim publicly, and it limits the accountability of incumbents who may be losing ground they are not reporting. What I keep coming back to is this synthesis. ChangXin Memory Technologies' qualification clock is genuinely fast in the market. It is entering and genuinely slow in the market. The incumbents can still defend, and the incumbents' ability to hold the high bandwidth memory frontier does not automatically protect the volume base that funds the frontier investment. That module has cleared the lab. The engineers signed off. Here is the 12-month call. By the end of 2026, contract dynamic random access memory prices will have eased from their first half peak. Samsung, Micron, and SK Hynix will be back to something closer to normal allocation. The shortage clock will have run its course. The qualification clock will not have reversed. ChangXin Memory Technologies will hold approved vendor list entries at multiple Tier 1 adjacent buyers, and reports suggest at least some Tier 1 assemblers that did not exist at the start of the year. Those entries will persist into 2027 product planning cycles. The assemblers will enter their next generation of product design with ChangXin Memory Technologies already in the database. My call is that the incumbents will read the shortage easing as vindication. Prices fell, buyers came back, the crisis resolved. That read is wrong. The crisis was never about prices. It was about which clock was setting the pace. The shortage clock was always going to ease. It eases by design, through capacity additions and demand normalization. The qualification clock only moves forward. The racer who crossed the qualification line during the shortage window is still on the track when supply returns. And approved vendor lists do not reset to zero because spot prices came down. A dynamic random access memory qualification file at a Tier 1 assembler runs to thousands of pages of characterization data, thermal maps, compatibility matrices, and reliability projections. Archiving that file, letting a supplier lapse, means someone has to actively decide to destroy thousands of hours of engineering work and start from zero if they ever want to requalify. No one budgets for that. Inertia is not laziness, it is arithmetic. That double data rate 5 module, the one that appeared as a restricted line item in the procurement record at the start of this video, is in the bill of materials now. The cost model includes ChangXin Memory Technologies pricing. The product generation that ships in late 2026 or early 2027 will carry a memory component that was not in consideration 2 years ago. Not because China caught up at the frontier, because a shelf ran empty at exactly the right moment, and the qualification clock had time to complete. A breakthrough is not the moment Chinese memory matches the incumbent specification sheet. It is the moment the pace of buyer adoption outruns the pace of supply recovery, and that moment happened quietly in procurement databases while the market was watching the price index. The shortage ended, the qualification didn't. Here is what I am watching for in the next 12 months. Does any Tier 1 assembler publicly disclose a supply relationship with ChangXin Memory Technologies? Or does the lock-in stay invisible, buried in approved vendor lists that no one publishes? Because if it stays invisible, the incumbents can keep telling a story about customer retention that the approved vendor databases are quietly contradicting. Drop your read in the comments. And if you want to watch the next leg of this race as it runs, subscribe and turn on notifications.